Welcome back, everyone, to the fifth and final episode of Napoleon in Egypt, where last we left off, he was abandoning his army in Egypt to return to France because of the political instability there. So we're going to dive into this. If you have not seen the first 4 episodes of my reaction to this series, the link is in the description. It'll take you back to the beginning. Link is also there for the original episode 5. And listen, I want to just clarify something from yesterday's episode. While I have been somewhat critical of some of the choices that Extra History has made and how they presented the series, please don't interpret that to mean that I think anything other than very highly of Extra History for their work. I have loved everything they do. There's a reason why I react to them more than anybody else. So if I'm offering constructive criticism, it's just that. It is in no way meant to mean that I don't think they do an amazing job. I just have some differences of opinion on how some of it's presented. But we all have our own biases. We all have our own ideas. We all have the things that matter to us. So that's just what that is. Take it for what it's worth. And I continue to be very grateful for Extra History's support of this channel. They always leave comments showing their support when I do a reaction to one of their series. And they do have kind of an addendum to this series about the Rosetta Stone, which was found during all of this. And was a huge breakthrough in understanding Egyptian history. I had the opportunity to see the Rosetta Stone when I was in London back in January, so that was pretty cool. So you'll get to see very soon. I'll have a video coming out from my visit to the British Museum. Fantastic stuff there. Let's go ahead and dive into part 5.
August 1799. "That Corsican runt!" General Kleber shouts as he storms into the meeting with his generals. In his hand, he clutches a long letter from Bonaparte. It informs him that he's now in charge of the French forces in Egypt and offers detailed instructions for running the occupation. Napoleon, he's just learned, has returned to France, leaving Kleber with a deteriorating military situation. The British are preparing a land force, the Arabs are in open revolt, and the French army is undersupplied, depleted, and plague-stricken.
So imagine having that thrust on you. Napoleon's out, he's gone, it's all yours now, what are you going to do? There are situations where this has happened in history. I think of, for example, the siege of Fort Donelson during the American Civil War. And yes, you have to take a drink because I just made a reference to the Civil War and something about the Napoleonic Wars, where the top 2 guys both basically say, I'm out, I can't be captured, it's all on you, and they drop it down to Simon Buckner to have to command an unwinnable situation. Same kind of things happening here.
Summarizing the situation, he tells his staff, "That bugger has deserted us with his breeches full of shit. When we get back to Europe, we'll rub it in his face." But none of them will dare do so.
No.
For Napoleon is only 3 months away from ruling France, and Kleber won't make it back to Europe at all. Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. When the Directory heard that Napoleon had returned to France, their first instinct was to put him on trial, which seemed reasonable. After years of infrequent contact and ruling Egypt independently from their control, he'd suddenly abandoned his post without orders. Sure, they had discussed him coming back, but they definitely hadn't called for him. Yet any thoughts of punishment quickly disappeared on October 9th as
So it's important to understand the situation here, right? This is not a situation where Napoleon Bonaparte is so powerful that it's a foregone conclusion that he's just going to do a military coup and take over the country. He's a general that's been out in Egypt who is still only about 30 years old, isn't even from France. He's Corsican. There's no reason for them to have thought that this guy was a real threat. It's really quite remarkable that he rises to power the way that he does as quickly as he does.
Bonaparte's carriage pulled up outside, and crowds thronged the streets, cheering for the hero of Egypt. He and his officers came in with style, displaying Mameluke sabers, exotic sashes, and tanned complexions. Only a month later, the Directory, already weakened by intrigues among its members, fell to a coup. Napoleon himself being the chief plotter and beneficiary, and in the wake of this, he took up the position of first consul, essentially a military dictator. You see, while the Egyptian campaign was a mess to anyone who'd witnessed it, Bonaparte had successfully managed to portray it through his letters and dispatches as a glorious campaign. And
doesn't matter what actually happened. What only matters is what people perceive happened. If you can control the narrative and if you can sell it as something positive, by the time they find out what really happened, it's too late. But once again, it's just fascinating to see how much Napoleon's life is modeled on Julius Caesar. And, you know, for me personally, when I start having conversations with people about the greatest military leaders of all time, Caesar and Napoleon are the first two that come to my mind. I know a lot of people will say Alexander the Great or Hannibal as well. To me, it's Caesar and Napoleon, and there's so many parallels, even now to him being first consul, a term that goes right back to the Roman Empire.
a large part of that was due to a group of men we've only touched on thus far in this series, the savants. Though the invasion of Egypt was for all intents and purposes a grab for colonies and resources, Napoleon's cadre of scientists, naturalists, geologists, and engineers had granted it a veneer of humanitarianism. France wasn't just taking territory, no, it was expanding knowledge. The irony, of course, was that the savants themselves were universally miserable and abused. Soldiers thought of them as useless, and there was widespread resentment against them from the beginning. The army incorrectly came to believe that these academics had been the ones to propose and lobby for the expedition, meaning troops blamed them for being stranded in Egypt. They also hilariously thought that the savants were looting treasures from the ancient tombs, meaning that soldiers frequently rifled through their baggage and sample jars, hoping to find gold. Yet the savants tried their best. They stayed with the army on the initial march to Cairo, and were subject to the outbreaks of blindness, extreme thirst, and Bedouin attacks. During the crossing of the desert, they made one of their first studies of new phenomena, investigating why soldiers sighted lakes on the horizon, only to see them disappear as they approached.
Mirage.
Oh yeah. The first big study the French did was on mirages. And, you know, if you're thinking that modern historians probably like using that as a metaphor for the expedition as a whole, you'd be very right. But it was in Cairo where their work began in earnest. Told to find a suitable headquarters, they took over an abandoned Mamluk palace and renamed it the Egyptian Institute.
And this is an important time period, right? Because while the military expedition fails, there are some successes that happen with these savants, and it really puts Egypt in a very unique position among some of these territories within the Ottoman Empire, to where they're going to be more successful. And this sets off this 19th century where there's going to be a ton of focus on Egyptology and study and science and history that's going to take place in Egypt.
This building would become a clearinghouse for information, a library to keep documents, a store for antiquities and samples, and a scientific institute. Savants would gather in the palace's former harems for lectures, as they presented their findings via formal papers on everything from taxonomy of Egyptian wildlife to research into mummification. Savants also spread out over Egypt to pursue niche interests or specialties. One would collect new invertebrates and insects, while another visited the Red Sea ports to dredge up shells, starfish, and other small marine animals. And as the French army pursued Murad Bey into Upper Egypt, several savants came along in order to survey and draw the temple complexes of Luxor, Thebes, and a half-dozen others. Most were abandoned, with the local population.
And let me just say that it's a place I hope to get to someday, and I've even thought about one of our next tours, you know, because we have the tours coming up that you can be a part of in Austria and Germany in October, and then next year in Italy. The Germany-Austria one's sold out, but we do have a few spots left on the Italy tour. I'll put a link down in the description for that if you want to check it out. But one of the other options is Egypt, and boy, I would love to see the temple complex at Luxor is just incredible stuff. And it's high on my list of places I'd like to visit if I ever get the chance.
Giving them a wide berth, and one had even been used to dump bodies of execution victims. But the scale drawings of these palaces and ink prints of their hieroglyphics would in many ways become more important than the artifacts they brought back to France. And of course, just before Napoleon's departure, engineers conducting restoration work on a fort uncovered an ancient Egyptian stele in 3 languages. The Rosetta Stone, the key to translating hieroglyphics. And let me tell you, that's enough of a story to warrant its own episode. I wonder when that will be happening. Wink. But not all of this work was meant to increase knowledge. The savants and artists were also part of the imperialist machine. When Napoleon took Cairo, it was that civilian complement that built 2 massive victory arches out of wood and painted canvases to celebrate the victory at the Battle of the Pyramids. Savants ran the printing presses that spat out the all-important propaganda, and several accompanied Bonaparte to the port of Suez to survey the ancient canal that once connected the Red Sea with the Nile. It was Napoleon's dream to redredge that canal, deep enough to accommodate modern trading and naval vessels.
And think about how huge that is, right? Because right now you got to go all the way around Africa with your ships to be able to go through the Mediterranean and cut through right there to the Red Sea. That's why even back in this time that's such an important idea. Same thing with the Panama Canal. Those little areas where just cutting through a little bit of land, and canals are built all the time at this point. It's a great task to do it, but certainly feasible.
And that was also what the savants were there for, to improve agriculture and make Egypt more productive as a French colony. Likewise, once the French were cut off by the Battle of the Nile, they were put to work manufacturing or finding replacements for any spare parts or other materials that they were no longer able to import from France. A group even created a sort of technological expo meant to overawe Egyptian leaders with the miracles of Western science. The argument being made was that the French were willing to bestow liberal government, technology, and infrastructure development in exchange for extracting Egypt's resources. Which might sound familiar if you're like a person who lives on Earth. The chronicler Al-Jabarti was present for this showcase and was impressed, apart from the demonstration of a hot air balloon which immediately caught fire and crashed among a crowd of screaming onlookers.
Now, there had been successful hot air balloon demonstrations before. There's a very famous scene in the TV show John Adams where you see John Adams and Thomas Jefferson present for one that goes up, and that had definitely been happening for a few decades by this point. But it's not very common yet. But you'll see this much later on in history where you'll start to see the use of hot air balloons for spotting for military, for example. Happens during the American Civil War a couple decades later.
And within months of Bonaparte's exit, it was clear that the French military situation was heading in a similar direction. General Kleber hashed out an agreement for a French withdrawal in January of 1800. But at the last minute, the British refused to sign it, and the Ottomans launched an enormous seaborne invasion. Though Kleber defeated it, a simultaneous revolt in Cairo and a fresh plague epidemic roiled the security situation for months, culminating when a 23-year-old student from Al-Azhar assassinated Kleber. Command then fell to General Abdullah de Menou, who had converted to Islam after marrying an Egyptian teenager. Menou, still unrealistically optimistic about the possibilities of a French colony in Egypt, dragged the occupation out for another year before a British Ottoman force defeated him in Alexandria. Always dismissive of the savants, Menou did not object when the British insisted that, as part of the surrender, they would hand over all Egyptian antiquities to be taken to the British Museum. Now,
the British Museum's got a lot of that stuff too. But you know what? So do the French. At the Louvre, they've got a lot of that same stuff.
Originally, the British also insisted that all the savants' notes and drawings also be surrendered, but after the academics threatened to destroy the documents rather than turn them over, they were allowed to keep them. And these drawings, impressions, and studies would later be compiled into 37 volumes to make up the book Description of Egypt, at the time the largest book in the world. Its enormously detailed prints would, in particular, influence the exoticized Western view of Egypt up until the modern day. Though that wasn't the savants' only legacy, their Egyptian Institute still exists as a center of Egyptology in Cairo today. The expedition also changed the course of Egyptian history. Muhammad Ali Pasha, one of the Ottoman commanders sent to eject the French in 1801, stayed, destroying the weakened Mamelukes and becoming the Ottoman governor of Egypt. Having witnessed French power, he, along with other Middle Eastern governments, embarked on a plan of reform and modernization.
So this is fascinating because we don't often think about how little events, right? To the majority of people in the world, if they know that Napoleon was in Egypt at all, it's kind of an afterthought. Even to a lot of people who study history, it's a little blip on the radar of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's going to do all these amazing things in Europe. People think, oh, okay, Egypt was kind of the sideshow. But for Egypt, these are defining moments. These are moments that determine the trajectory of that nation for the next 200 plus years. Little things that happen there that maybe are an afterthought to people in France or in Europe or in the West are pivotal to the Egyptians.
His family would govern the country until a revolutionary coup gained Egypt full independence in 1952. Napoleon, for his part, didn't really care about these changes on the ground. Egypt had served its purpose for him, for he'd rewritten the history of the expedition to suit his ever-increasing cult of personality. Paintings cast him as a heroic explorer, part scientist, part general, and never hinted that he lost 30,000 men in a failure that gained nothing for France. Yet he did gain something personally. A taste for absolute power. The man who had ruled Egypt independently and referred to himself in proclamations as the Great Sultan Bonaparte.
That's an excellent point that they make there, and not something I'd really thought about, is that having that autonomous kind of running the show in Egypt makes him think, you know what? I could do this in France, but without all those pesky Egyptians and with a full army to back me and to protect me against the British and the Ottomans. I could do this. I want to do this. That makes a lot of sense.
Had found what it was like to have a crown. And if Egypt would not let him be king, perhaps France would have him as an emperor.
All right, well, we're going to wrap it up right there. I'm probably going to be running a 24/7 live stream of the Napoleonic Wars series that I did, if you want to check that out. And yes, at some point we will dive into Napoleon's marshals. Just got some other things I want to do first, but we'll definitely get there. As always, thanks for watching. We will see you again soon.